there are a lot of things about Mass Effect Andromeda that worked well. There are several things that Andromeda did better than the original trilogy. Despite the fact that Andromeda has its flaws, it also has things that are worth carrying forward into the future. For a moment, I'd like you to pause and forego any debate about Andromeda's shortcomings because I'm not here to defend those or convince you of Andromeda's merit back in 2017. At the time of this video's production, it is 2020, 3 years since the release of Mass Effect Andromeda, and the focus, as it should be, is on the future. BioWare has all but confirmed that work on new Mass Effect games is continuing. The studio manager and former creative director for the Mass Effect trilogy, Casey Hudson, has stated in multiple developer videos, blogs, and tweets that he's excited for Mass Effect's future. EA has stated on investor relations calls and in press statements that the franchise will continue, and Mike Gamble, a producer on the original trilogy and Mass Effect Andromeda, has now taken on the title of Project Director since the most recent N7 Day video, suggesting he's now the main creative lead on whatever the next Mass Effect project is. A new Mass Effect game is still likely years away, but we are getting a new Mass Effect game at some point. It's easy, too easy in fact, to simply recount the fan-favorite elements of the original trilogy and think that loyalty to nostalgia is enough to make the Mass Effect game that we want. It isn't. Whether you played Andromeda once and disliked it, whether you're a fan like me and have played it multiple times and loved it, or you're someone who never played it for whatever reason but consider yourself to be a fan of Mass Effect, I'm not here to convince you that Andromeda was great or to defend its faults. I'm only making this video to do one thing, to make the case that there are elements, pieces of Mass Effect Andromeda that are worth keeping in any future Mass Effect games. With that in mind, let's talk about what Andromeda did right. If you compare Andromeda to the trilogy, you'll actually find that it has more hubs, more hub exploration, and more non-quest dialogue than Mass Effect 2 or 3, and probably even more than Mass Effect 1. That's huge. That's one of the best parts about Mass Effect. One of my favorite things to do in Mass Effect, or any role-playing game really, is just to walk around and talk to NPCs. Walking through the Presidium on the Citadel in Mass Effect 1 was a defining moment in gaming. It was the most real and alive that a large-scale science fiction RPG had ever felt, and that was in large part because it felt, for the time, well-populated and reactive. Walking around the Nexus in Mass Effect Andromeda, walking around Aya or Kadara Port, or the Paradise on Eladin, or New Tachanka on Eladin, it's apparent that Andromeda was striving for the same feeling, and actually Andromeda surpassed the trilogy in the depth and quantity of its non-urgent dialogue. I stress the term non-urgent because it's an integral piece of creating a breathing, living world. It's also counterintuitive to conventional storytelling wisdom because in a typical format like film or TV, writers are taught to eliminate unnecessary ancillary characters and dialogue. But in a role-playing game where a player directs their own flow to the story, laying out characters and conversations that don't directly lead to quests makes you feel like you're in a real place populated with real people, not just a game space populated with quest dispensers pretending to be people. Of course, many characters in Andromeda do give quests, and that's good because we like those, but many of them just tell you their story if you ask them. Many of them tell you why they came to Andromeda, what motivated them. Some of them will ask you to stop and actually initiate a conversation with you and have something to say to the Pathfinder. This might seem like a small thing, but at a time when many developers are reducing story and dialogue content in games, it's a real triumph to see BioWare actually pushing in the right direction here with Andromeda. Next is that Andromeda has more Squadmate interactions between the squad not involving Ryder than the trilogy ever had with the crew of the Normandy. Mass Effect 3 was really going in the right direction on this. We all remember Garrus and Vega swapping war stories, or Garrus and Joker trading jokes aboard the Normandy, but Andromeda takes it even further, adding frequent party exchanges on board the Tempest, while driving around in the Nomad, and even occasionally between squad mates in different hub areas like Aya. Seeing the squad interact like this makes them all feel more like real people and not just backstory dispensers talking to the player character. Speaking of the crew of the Tempest, like the Normandy, the crew can be broken up into squad mates who go out on missions with you, and other crew members like Joker in the original trilogy who work on the ship exclusively. While I don't like Callow, the pilot of the Tempest, as much as I like Joker, there's no arguing that overall there's way more, way deeper content for the crew in Andromeda than there ever was in the trilogy. If you really go back and check, there's actually only a couple of conversations that you can have with Joker or Presley or Adams on board the Normandy in Mass Effect 1. There's a few more in ME2 and 3, but in Andromeda, the non-squad crew all have their own storylines. The seeds of this were there in Mass Effect 2 and 3, but the stories for Gil and Suvi and Lexi and Callow all felt more personal and natural than what we had ever seen before. They actually felt like people living and working aboard your ship, and not just decoration that was given a side quest as a depth feature. Third is level design. The key missions in Andromeda are exceptionally well laid out. If you pay close attention to missions like the Solarian Arc mission, or Cora's loyalty mission on the Asari Arc, or Liam's loyalty mission, or many others, you'll notice how well verticality is used, you'll notice how evenly spaced cover is, or how the environment can be interacted with. There are multiple ways to succeed using the map to your advantage depending on which class you've spec'd out for this mission and your chosen playstyle. Enemy variety is well balanced for difficulty, and even in interiors and corridors, action rarely feels stifled by linearity the way that it could at times during the trilogy. Mass Effect 1 action sequences mostly took place in generic and sparsely designed rooms, or in corridors that had enemies running straight at you. This improved slightly in Mass Effect 2 and 3, but the series before Andromeda mostly kept its linear structure designed to combat. Andromeda is the first Mass Effect game to open up combat to verticality and wider ranges of attack. We'll talk more about combat in general in just a bit, but first I want to talk about the fourth major improvement in Andromeda, and that's customization. Weapon and gear customization in Andromeda are by far the best in the series, hands down. You can customize any weapon in the game and most armor pieces after acquiring them, but moreover, you can further customize gear by crafting it yourself and applying special augmentations during the crafting process to make it more unique. And finally, through research, you can continue to improve certain weapons or armor sets that you find most useful to craft even better versions of them. I always liked the Mass Effect 1 approach of having multiple underlays to allow for armor customization, but weapons and armor could only be customized through mods and you couldn't create any gear from scratch. When you combine research, crafting, augmentation, and mods, Andromeda is, without a doubt, the best Mass Effect game for gear customization. Fifth on our list is economy and trading. Now, this is sort of a minor one, but I really thought it was worth listing because of how subtle and yet how effective it is. Economy has never mattered in Mass Effect games before. You get credits and gear just by playing, and by the end of it your character has a lot of money and nothing to spend it on. That can be fairly common in a lot of RPGs, but I always felt that Mass Effect was a particularly egregious offender. I mean, there's really no point to credits in Mass Effect 1 at all. Maybe you might spend some credits on Spectre gear or licenses, but that's never enough to absorb the massive amount of space cash that you end up with. Mass Effect 2 and 3 at least tied up some of your assets with upgrades for the Normandy, but that always felt disconnected from the wider economy as a whole, which is a real miss, especially in Mass Effect 3 when a war economy could have proven a unique added difficulty to Shepard's mission. In Andromeda, you don't find a lot of credits, and you can't make a lot of credits by selling gear. You can, however, find lots of resources like minerals, organic material, and alien components, and you can either make a lot of money or trade for a lot of stuff using those resources. You may not immediately realize it, but that's actually brilliant, because that's exactly how a nascent economy in a frontier galaxy would work. That's exactly how frontier economies in history have worked. Money, whether it's minted coin or paper money from the home country that colonists came from, isn't really worth as much in practical terms as raw materials needed to build and craft the things that settlers need on the frontier. So in Andromeda, you actually end up with relatively few credits, but if you work hard exploring, you can amass a veritable fortune in rare minerals and use that as a wealth base to barter for weapons, consumable combat items, armor, gear augmentations, which can be quite expensive, and nomad upgrades, which can sometimes need very rare materials that are harder to come by. Sixth on the list is that different gear actually matters to playstyle a lot more. Now this point is closely related to number 4, which was gear customization, and I almost included it as one item, but I do think it deserves its own call out. Basically in the trilogy, gear didn't affect gameplay styles that much. You could get some decent buffs with armor, but you mainly found one combination that you liked or one that looked good, and kept it the whole way through unless you just wanted to try some new looks. In Andromeda, because of the crafting and the augmentation and the modding system, you can legitimately make armor and weapon sets that drastically alter your playstyle. Certain gear can make your melee damage way higher, and give you cool added defense tactics against enemy melee. Certain armor sets, if crafted and augmented properly, can lend major boosts to biotic or tech abilities and basically demand that you pair them with certain profiles you've spec'd out. And since Andromeda is specifically designed for you to blend and cross-class builds, then it seems only natural to craft and keep more than one armor set to complement your different styles. Again, this might seem small or very closely related to gear customization, but when combined with the leveling system, easy respecking, and blended classes, it really does add to the fun and replayability of Andromeda as compared to the trilogy. 7th on the list, and this is a big one, is exploration. Mass Effect at its core was always meant to center on exploration, and planet exploration is at its best in Andromeda. Mass Effect 1 had more quantity, but the quality of the design and the depth of what was available to be depicted as far as the different biomes was severely lacking for the time. And remember that Mass Effect 2 basically only had 10 true side missions, and Mass Effect 3 abandoned the idea of planet exploration altogether. Andromeda is hands down the best in the series that we have ever seen when it comes to delivering on the promise of being dropped onto a planet and exploring until you find something interesting. Now, I know that BioWare's open world design can be lacking, sure. Vold in particular suffers from too much space, not enough depth, bad side quests, and boring pacing. However, there is a marked difference between planets when it comes to open world design. Kadara, for instance, is really well designed. The environment is set up in such a way where you're still free to go in any direction, but you're gently guided by the terrain, the mountains, the quest markers for the critical path if you happen to have those enabled on the map, and then the environmental design is just set up perfectly to pique your interest with a small outpost or some visual point of reference in the distance. The wind farm on Kadara is a great example of this. And then most importantly, once you engage with whatever you went over to investigate, the stories are actually good. There are several side quests that I think are some of the best in the game, and you'll notice that many of those good side quests, even if they don't start on Kadara, end up taking you to that planet, and they're a part of the fit and the lore for that world. Eladin is not quite as good as Kadara in my mind, but it's still got its own merits when it comes to open world design. The water processing on that planet is a great example of thorough environmental design that leads into a surprisingly good side storyline. Andromeda is more vast than anything we'd ever seen in the original trilogy, and at times it can suffer from its size. But there are also moments where the vision of an open-world Mass Effect game is well realized, and that's something that I don't think we should abandon so quickly. 8th on the list is combat. This one probably won't surprise anyone. I already mentioned combat earlier, and moreover, combat is the one element of Andromeda that was actually almost universally praised on release. When Andromeda launched, it was taking a beating, and it was not getting praised for a whole lot. But even the harshest critics had good things to say about the combat. Adding verticality was huge. Adding more mobility overall was huge. Taking everything off of a strictly linear structure was huge. The combat in Andromeda is faster, more varied, has more good difficulty and less cheap difficulty, and has the best balance on weapons versus powers that we've ever seen before. It's basically the same gameplay loop. That gameplay loop of prime combos, detonate combos, shoot guns while powers recharge has never been better. It's honed, it's clearly defined, and it's distilled down and expertly tuned. I think that the combat in Mass Effect 1 is light years behind the other games, so I'm not even really going to use that in the comparison, but if we start with Mass Effect 2 as the starting point for this gameplay loop, it's sort of like the evolution between Halo 1 and Halo 3 if you're familiar with that combat style. Andromeda is doing many of the same things as Mass Effect 2 and 3, but with way more efficiency. I'm not going to say too much more about combat because I feel like that is the one area of Andromeda that doesn't need a lot of defending. If you've heard just about any critic talk about Mass Effect Andromeda, you've heard people praise the combat and why it's good. 9th on our list is the fact that Andromeda is by far the most visually impressive game in the series. Now, I know immediately you think to yourself that this is a given because Andromeda is the latest in the series and so resolution and graphical fidelity are naturally higher. But if we take a minute and really examine the visuals of Andromeda, we can see that it's actually more than that. The incredible vistas on Eos or Kadara, the dark alien interiors of the Remnant vaults and how they blend organic and artificial surroundings, the galaxy map, the sleek design of the Tempest, and the general variety of environments that we see in Andromeda all reveal a thorough and ambitious vision to create a visual style unlike any other that we've seen in Mass Effect before. I think that Mass Effect games have always looked great for their time, and I think that thanks to the original art director Derek Watts, the series has always had a distinct look and feel, but Andromeda clearly managed to push that forward, to push forward the original art style into something that felt more organic and more alien. And when it came to wide open space, they clearly succeeded in giving the exteriors an incredible sense of scale. All of this falls under the heading of visuals, and it's for that reason that I think we should appreciate this new direction. I hope wide open expanses and true biome diversity are elements that continue in all of the Mass Effect games to come. And finally, last on our list, but certainly not least, we have our protagonist in Andromeda, Ryder. Ryder isn't perfect as a protagonist, granted. There are certainly things that could have been done better, especially in some of the dialogue choices, but conceptually, Ryder is exactly what the aim needed to be in order to stop the series from becoming purely derivative and predictable. As much as we all love Shepard and miss Shepard, trying to create another Shepard as a protagonist isn't going to work. There's never going to be another Commander Shepard, ever. That means your best shot at creating a protagonist that resonates with people is to do something that's distinct and different when compared to Shepard. Ryder, in many ways, is that protagonist. He's young, he's inexperienced at the start, he lives in the shadow of his father, a former N7 operative, and someone very much in that mold of Shepard. Ryder has to face the repercussions of his own inexperience, and it shows. I know a lot of people bemoan the fact that there's one scene early on in Andromeda when there's a team meeting on board the Tempest and the crew is dismissive of Ryder's leadership. They're disrespectful and leave before Ryder releases them. This happens in a similar fashion again later on, and that frustrated players who wanted to play Ryder as an experienced, capable leader right from the start. I get that. That never would have happened to Shepard. But the thing is, Ryder isn't Shepard. Ryder is, according to canon, 22 years old at the start of the events in Andromeda, and while he served in the military and worked on the Citadel, that's still a ripe young age to be asked to lead a group of experienced people. The key thing to remember, which most people don't, is that later on in the story, there are other similar meetings with the crew of the Tempest in which Ryder does lead them confidently. And to me, these meetings were clearly intended to serve as a device to showcase Ryder's growth as a leader. By the time you're heading into the endgame, it's clear that Ryder is the undisputed leader of his crew and everyone really respects him for it. That type of character growth is something Shepard actually lacked. One of the legitimate criticisms of the original trilogy is that Shepard is mostly static, except for parts of Mass Effect 3. He mostly stays the same. I'm not saying that Ryder's character growth was handled perfectly in Andromeda, but that having a flawed, somewhat vulnerable protagonist with a discernible weakness and a clear need to grow is better than having a bulletproof caricature of a super soldier. Maybe the next Mass Effect protagonist will be older, maybe they'll have a stronger military record like Shepard did, and that's totally fine, but the best thing for Mass Effect or any future BioWare games is to include a hero that's like us, flawed and self-aware, the kind of person who doesn't wake up a hero, but learns how to make the sacrifices necessary to inhabit that role when called upon by circumstance and destiny. Mass Effect Andromeda wasn't perfect, but for better or worse, whatever comes next for Mass Effect now follows in its footsteps. I know that there were flaws, and memes, and lots of negativity. It's easy to get caught up in that and miss or forget the good parts. But I hope that by laying out these examples, you see what I see. Not looking back at missed opportunities, but looking forward considering what was done well. Andromeda left us clues, hints, of what a great Mass Effect game in the future could be like. I'm not saying that Andromeda is the blueprint for everything that we want in Mass Effect, but I am saying that it laid out a trail of hope for us to follow, towards a bright future that we can look forward to. This has been The Exalted March, a conversation about storytelling and design in video games. If you like this video, please consider hitting the like button, and if you'd like to be informed of all future videos, please consider hitting the subscribe button. I do have more to say about Andromeda, including the things that I don't think should stay in the future of Mass Effect games, so stay tuned for that. You can also find me on Twitter and Instagram at The Exalted March. As always, thank you for watching, and thanks for listening.